On the exhibition, we want to thank the Rosencrantz Collection and the Whitney for making this incredible show happen. We're so excited to have you here today for this panel, The Archive as Future Knowledge, presented in conjunction with the exhibition. Our panelists include Chrissie, artist Korakrit Arunanondchai, Kandis Williams, Alan Michelson, scholar Michael B. Gillespie, and Whitney, Director of Research Resources, Farris Wahbeh. Our panelists will each speak for about 8 minutes, and then we will open the floor up for questions. And I will now hand the mic to Chrissie Iles. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Chrissie Iles, curator at the Whitney, and Joel Ehrenkranz Curator, and curator of Mountain Time, along with Nisa Jackson and Simone. I'm delighted to welcome you all here from my position as curator, and I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're guests on the land of the Ute Nation, and here the Mountain Ute Nation, and we're very grateful to be here in the mountains that are such a sacred place for them. I'd like to thank Nicola Lees, director of the museum, for inviting me to curate this exhibition. It's a unique collaboration between the Whitney and the Aspen Art Museum. It's a very sort of special one. I'd also like to thank the entire museum staff. This is not an easy show to put together. It's incredibly ambitious, and they've been extraordinary. I particularly like to thank Kate Myra and Eric Angus for installing the show so beautifully with their team, and just everyone on staff. And of course, I'd like to thank all the artists. 3 of the artists in the show are on the panel. Some of the other artists in the show are here: Maya Ruth Lee, Khalil Joseph, Doug Aitken. And I really want to thank you all for, I think Clarissa Tosinto, Clarissa here. And I really want to thank you all for your work, for your trust, and for our ongoing dialogue, because that's really what produced the exhibition. I'd also like to thank Michael Gillespie, who's here with us on the panel, for his scholarship and curating and for our ongoing dialogue, which is also shaping so much of my thinking too. I learned so much from you all. Also want to acknowledge Farris Wahbeh, because our ongoing dialogue in building this collection and the framework for its support and care is crucial. And also our media preservation network team back in New York, whose technical expertise and care of our time-based works is such an integral part of their ongoing stewardship. I'd like to thank Robert Rosencrantz, whose incredible collection of video has formed such a key part of this exhibition, who is one of the absolute great video collectors and whose vision is just extraordinary. So thank you, Robert, for all your amazing support. It's just your support of my vision for the show, support of the museum and the artists and the collection. So thank you, Robert, for your leadership in the field. I'd also like to acknowledge Pam and Dick Kramlich, who are here with us, who are real kind of pioneers in the field of moving image work and installation right from the 90s, and have this extraordinary collection. This is a field that is it's a very particular field. It's an extremely important field, and you really, your vision has been very important for that. So just a few introductory thoughts before I hand over to the artists who we really want to hear and listen to. So I just a few introductory thoughts that will hopefully help maybe contribute to the discussion. And you know, the thoughts are about the archival and how it operates as future knowledge. And there are several things. So many works in the show address this in very many different ways, as we'll hear. How does the archival operate as future knowledge? Well, it makes historical information that's often lost or displaced present. It also creates a kind of non-hierarchical spatiality, especially installation work, and that makes space for collaborative authorship and the relationship between the artworks and what is in the archival material that's in the artworks. It creates a very sort of this non-hierarchical spatiality, both conceptual and physical, because this is a sort of hybrid space of installation, which involves the entire space of the gallery, is something I think very significant. And the artists work with the archival and with material also recodes traditional archival spaces in ways that are reparative, creating the possibility for redress and recovery. And as the Black Scholar Journal argues, how could the possibilities for creating another kind of archive and other modes through which Black lived experiences are documented and remembered? And artists working with these questions are also asking very crucial questions about care, legibility, labor, refusal, and repair. Sometimes artists themselves create an archive. We'll hear from Krit about his living archive, this ongoing series of films. Arthur Jaffa, AJ, has been creating an archive for over 30 years. Other artists draw from archives of their own making, like Kamaya Ruth Lee, who's here with us, AJ and Khalil with Black News, and then some artists work from archives and transform the material they find in a very research-based practice. We'll hear from Kandis about that. And of course, we have the internet as a kind of mega archive. And you know, one interesting example of this is when you see Mark Leckie's Fiorucci Made Me Hardcore downstairs. And then that piece was made before Google Images or the video was available on the internet. So it was extremely hard for him to get that archival footage. He was working with used sort of VHS tapes that he'd managed to find. And so, you know, the question of access, which is a huge question. But, you know, in terms of that piece, what's really interesting is to see how Mark Leckie took excerpts from a film called The Wigan Casino by Tony Palmer, who is commissioned by Granada TV, Northern Television in England, to make a documentary on Northern Soul underground dance clubs, who were absolutely passionate about soul music from Detroit, not commercial soul music, but the soul music you could only hear in Detroit and actually in the north of England. And so there's a moment in Black News where Khalil reappropriates Leckie's appropriation of Tony Palmer's film and resituates that film. So, you know, there's these layers and different approaches. Alan Michelson's work, where are you? Over here now, draws on historical memory, indigenous philosophy to uncover suppressed histories and present indigenous perspectives. So, you know, I'll just end by saying, you know, the material, very sort of fragmentary nature of archival material, whether in libraries and archives or digitally online, calls for interpretation and reinterpretation, and Farris will address this. So the archive is a latent tool for both reinterpreting the past and reimagining the future. They may be original materials in terms of their material form, but as Hal Foster observes, they're traces, they're incomplete, they're always points of new departures. And so I'll just end by saying, you know, the moving image is a medium that has its own unique archival properties in itself because it's able to hold other mediums: photography, music, dance, drawing, performance, literature, poetry, language. And that holding really allows something unique to happen. And its fluid, flexible nature is both its strength and its vulnerability. Vulnerability because the artists in Mountain Time and all the artists working with moving installations in our collection and beyond are really creating this hybrid space that's not the cinema, it's not the gallery, but it has elements of both, but it has elements of other kinds of spaces too, conceptually and physically. When we walk into Krit's installation, we smell it, we smell the earth on the floor almost before we see it or hear it. And there's something very profound about that. It's a real kind of, you know, in a way, refusal of that white modernist space of the gallery as an assumed default. we have so many different examples of that throughout the exhibition. And so, the Whitney's own moving image collection, which is one of the largest museum collections of moving image art in the world, I think, at over 800 works, is also itself an archive. And one of the most important responsibilities of this archive is the care of the works we're stewarding in perpetuity, lifting, making visible, and supporting the voices of artists, and bringing works together in resonance with each other intergenerationally. How does Bill Greaves' Psychotaxiplasm, or Ulysses Jenkins' Without Your Interpretation, or Melvana Ballinger's Rain Yesha relate to contemporary work, for example? How does a work by Diane Severin-Nguyen, who's here with us, who's an artist in our collection, here today with us, resonate with historical works that address the impact of the Vietnam War? There are many, many ways in which the archive creates this sort of future knowledge. And we're giving people in 100 years' time, 200 years' time, tools to tell stories about our time now, when the world will have transformed in ways we can't even begin to imagine. So those are just some introductory thoughts, and I'd now like to hand over to Korakrit, and we're going to go round until we get to Farris, and then we'll have a discussion. So thank you.
Hi. So there's 8 minutes, and I think I probably speak best through my in the work, but so I wrote this down, and I'm gonna read it. So I've been working on one series of work called The Living Archive for the past almost 12 years and ongoing into the future, probably until I die. It consists of film and video installation that have been made, and they all kind of connect and take like perhaps the corpse or the materials or the leftover of each other like forward, and make essentially time, probably time and change as, the most important material in this work. I think certain things that may have happened, like in the work, say 12 years ago when I started filming my grandfather, and then a year ago when he passed away, like maybe certain parts of those works that I didn't maybe like truly understand or have a different understanding now even. We're all living archives in a way, both conscious and unconscious. Our bodies, our DNA, our inherent stories, both outside and inside of us. The one we choose to believe and the one that are inscribed to us. Being an artist, it is a way for me to externalize the impossibility of connecting, and also an attempt to try anyways. I started filming my grandfather as he was suffering from short-term memory loss. And in a way, it was about that impossibility, perhaps, to connect to him, his stories, and the beliefs that have, been inscribed with him through his time. The social and the group becomes a stage for relationships to form and meet. The installation becomes a stage for all these relationships to reform themselves and perhaps meet again. What links these prior generations, perhaps, to me, or the myth, the stories that are inherited. Documentary itself is a violent act, but also for me, the exploitation of myself as an artist and a person living in the world is also perhaps my only tool to change the story. So a story that I often work with in the work, seen as the bird and the snake. In Hindu myth, it's Naga and the Garuda, and in Christianity, it's known as the snake in the Garden of Eden and the angels. They become important structures for me to think through power relationships. The bird looks down from the top and speaks for higher power and the regime of order. It record, index, categorize, and control what is below. In Painting with History 3, the work that's being shown in the museum below, the bird becomes the drone. The Naga, or the snake, is what's lurking under the muddy waters. This is the space of the ghosts and the people and the songs that cannot be recorded and organized under the regime. It will always escape and find ways to re-represent itself through the different mediums that are available at times. This anarchic energy is all of us, what makes people humans. In Songs for Dying, the second video that's shown below, the naga becomes the dragon, and the naga becomes the dragon which the empire builds itself against. The idea of the ghost cinema is it's part of the performance I'm going to do during the Aspen Art Week. So Day of the Ghost Cinema is a gathering to watch movies with spirits, using the darkness as a space to storytell and redefine and renegotiate these stories that oppress us through history. The ghost is the metaphor, but also a lived reality. And it always needs a body to connect. The story in the performance and the video, No History in a Room Filled with People with Funny Names 5, it's about it's the story of the caretaker who's also the story writer and the care receiver who must follow and live out that narrative. In the video, it was the spirit of America that possesses Thailand during the Vietnam War and how it shaped political structure, and also the hegemonic story of the monarchy, the military, and the religion. And I would say that in my work, perhaps in an attempt to even connect and rewrite those stories, I give these like monarchy, military, and religion even like a voice. Like I try to author those voice to perhaps speaks to the snake, perhaps. These stories are decomposing and changing, and the living archive is a place for me where all this decomposition is constantly happening, and yeah, the future can form itself. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Is it on? Is it? Okay, no problem. This is going to be kind of a lot less concise than Chris, probably. I'm going to essentially, just sort of talk through, I guess, the first slide. So my piece downstairs is called A Triadic Ballet, which is based on the Oscar Schlemmer's Triadic Ballet from 1923. Oscar Schlemmer was the master of forms, or the prop master and costume designer for the Bauhaus. I think he was appointed to that position in 1923. So I'll just talk a little bit about Schlemmer and the Triadic Ballet as part of a line, which is a larger exhibition I did at 52 Walker that opened in October. And then I'll read two really long quotes, one from my friend Hannah Black, who wrote about the exhibition, and another one from Oscar Schlemmer. So Schlemmer, this is Schlemmer's schema for stage, cult, and popular entertainment. And what I like about this this diagram is that it also sort of like encapsulates a lot of Schlemmer's understanding and thoughts around the potentiality of theater. And also theater as, like, I think Schlemmer thought of the body as an event. And so he was also always trying to sort of visualize through his costuming and his prop forms the paths of that event and the negative spaces between the body and the scene as though they were solid forms. So he's trying to see paths of limbs as paths of theatrical and spiritual potential. And in that way, he's really folding a way to see history onto its own present tenses. So he's using the body and the costuming, and especially these sort of diagrams, to understand, sort of how to. I think the body has this issue of being an archive, as Krit was saying, and dance. I think especially Schlemmer's idea of dance really points to exactly how that issue is exacerbated. The issue of the archive is exacerbated. Metaphysically, complicated metaphysically with dance. So he wanted to see how the body signifies event, and to be able to visualize not just paths and formations, but also cultural formations, social formations, literary and artistic formations that impacted the body as it moves through space. So with Align, with the Greater Show for 52 Walker, I tried to understand especially how white Western choreographers and the sort of invention of dance notation, a la Rudolph von Laban, Martha Graham, and Schlemmer himself, sort of dabble in the drama of abstraction as a human event. One that I think Edward Glissant notes is one of the major sort of formations of theater, or why theater is vital to the formation of the nation state, I should say, is that it, in so many ways, exacerbates exactly these kind of theatrical qualities, what Schlemmer would call the theater as a moral institution. So dance, I believe, is a really powerful, you can go to the next slide, maybe. This is Schlemmer's diagram of man and figure. So he's kind of marking off, especially the different spaces, right? That psychology has an ethical component, but it also has a material component. That the body as a machine has a, mechanism in space, is a mechanism in space, but it's also, a referent to machinic and natural forms. You can go to the next slide. So this is a still from the Triadic. And I think dance in a really particular way, and especially thinking about national identities, is particularly powerful to the question of the archive, because dance as a form really comforts a lot of genocidal narratives in that it concedes to the spectator that the body, the author, and the context is always temporary or fleeting. And so also it sort of intends to create a necessarily deteriorated or constantly deteriorating, stressful, contorted, ever on display space for viewing the body, and I think also for viewing past bodies, future bodies. And in that way, dance becomes a kind of, the ephemera of dance becomes a kind of debris. So it leaves behind spirit, intention, affect. And those debris, I think this debris relieves also the archive of needing to stretch, flex, shrink, or recoil in its own right to capture certain forms. They're conceived of as already gone once the dance is finished. So the ways that the archive and dance come out of the political institutions of especially ethnography and colonial violences, the removal of sacred or ritualistic experiences and replacement of them with photographs, places where communal props and costumes are now under plexi containers, the commodification of religious experience and signification, and the places that the living descendants of especially indigenous, Afro-Asian living descendants have to sort of understand as a space, then are forced to understand sort of as a space of the tail end of ritual, but the formation of historical legacy. That was the spiral. Okay. So dance as an archive plays a lot in the metaphysical, which allows it to constantly reproduce itself then as both a question and a mimetic space. So a space where learning is doubled as viewing. This space essentially resists the archive in beautiful ways, because dance has to live in vernacular to make meaning, and it has to live in vernacular well before it can transcend into the archive. Once it's sort of committed to the archive, it already becomes almost fossil or evidence of history. And therefore, I think it becomes a site of great national importance. Again, to reference Glissant, that the folkloric and mythological are the original circuits of knowledge, but they can neither shape nor limit it. So dance becomes this really beautiful poetic elegy to permanence in remarkable ways, but then it also reifies race in ways that are sort of untraceable and yet hyper-represented. So I'm looking specifically at Schlemmer via choreographers like Ailey Dunham, Donald McHale, and especially thinking about Black choreographers and the idea that the body is an access point to ancestral experience. Okay, so the next slide. Next slide. I really want to read Hannah's quote, but I'm already over time. A minute? Okay, so I'll read Hannah's quote. I'll read a little bit of Schlemmer, actually. This is from Man and Figure, 1921. One of the emblems of our time is abstraction. It functions on the one hand to disconnect components from an existing and persisting whole, either to lead them individually ad absurdum or to elevate them to their greatest potential. On the other hand, abstraction can result in generalization and summation in the construction in bold outline of a new totality. And then from Hannah Black, 22. We have two primitive sources, said Martha Graham in 1930, dangerous and hard to handle in the arts, but of intense psychic significance, the Indian and the Negro. That these influence us is certain. The Negro with his rhythms of disintegration, the Indian by his intense integration, his sense of ritualistic tribal drama. For Graham, America is also represented a paradoxically modern instance of the primitive, a naive movement into an open space, the white nation as a form of choreography.
You're sitting in the wrong spot.
I thought you were next. You can go next if you want.
Oh no, it's all you know.
Okay. Tragically, what we're now witnessing in the unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine, in which the Russian army is destroying non-military targets like people's homes and farms, is killing peaceful civilians, including the elderly, women and children, are raping and torturing, has parallels in the so-called settling of the United States. There are unfortunate parallels not only in the violence and bloodshed, but in the state-sponsored propaganda used to justify it, demonizing Ukrainians, excuse me, and their president as Nazi fascists. To justify the genocidal invasion of the sovereign indigenous nations of Turtle Island, our name for the continent, the United States and its colonial predecessors constructed and disseminated similar propaganda about our supposed inferiority. We are referred to in the Declaration of Independence as the, quote, merciless Indian savages, blamed for the violence that proceeded from defending our lands from people who believed the absurd notion enshrined in the papal doctrine of discovery in American law that they, as European Christians, had more of a right to our lands than we did. Colonial ideology spread in newspapers, illustrations, and paintings branded us as inherently violent savages with few rights, occupying rich land and resources we didn't deserve. Ideology that has persisted for centuries and over time has taken many forms, including explorer and missionary journals, captivity narratives, novels such as those of Fenimore Cooper, in which my people, the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Six Nations or the Iroquois Confederacy, are misrepresented, monuments, history books, spectacles such as Buffalo Bill's Wild West, and the Hollywood movies that followed. Along with maps, written deeds, and treaties, and other governmental records, these ideological representations constitute an archive from which a false narrative that passes for history has been constructed, to which most of us have been not only exposed, but conditioned from childhood. Events challenging those narratives and perceptions, such as the indigenous protest at Standing Rock, or the national scandal and tragedy of Indian residential schools, have finally made it into the news, and Americans are tearing down monuments and questioning the whitewashed history they've been fed. And on the cultural front, which is simultaneously a political front, contemporary indigenous artists and other artists of color are calling out this history in their work, and along with our scholars and writers, injecting much needed, long overdue truth-telling into the national consciousness, efforts that are felt to be so threatening by some that 42 states have resorted to some form of official suppression and 17 states outright bans on the truth. One of the prime means through which we artists are surfacing buried histories and challenging the official propagandized ones is through exploring and appropriating the archives, using the archives against those ideologies to tell another story. Tuscarora scholar and artist Jolene Ricard has theorized these challenges as examples of what she has termed visual sovereignty. I've utilized archival materials in my practice for over 30 years, sometimes behind the scenes in my research, sometimes presented directly in the work in some form, such as in my works in Mountain Time, which draw on a 1941 Hollywood movie and 1926 footage of an event marking the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Greasy Grass, also known as the Battle of the Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand, showing the mounted Lakota veterans of the battle. In 2019, I was invited to create a new work for one of the collateral exhibitions during the Venice Biennale that would speak to Venice's role in the early European exploration of North America as a center for cartography and the publishing of explorer accounts. The work I made is a 4-channel video installation projected onto 4 spheres titled Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, Theater of the World, after the first modern European world atlas, and designed after a second iconic atlas, the 1708 Harmonia Macrocosmica of Andreas Cellarius, illustrating Copernicus's heliocentric model of the universe. So that's 4 renditions of the Earth with a central sun shining light on the 4 faces of these globes. 4 videos subtitled Les Sauvages, Viaggi, War Dance and Relations, project in sequence, each on a separate sphere, the spheres being installed in a cruciform arrangement inhabiting one of the cardinal points. The visuals of the work are entirely curated and constructed from historical archival material, including maps, music, paintings, and illustration, photography, video clips, and sound bites from Native activists. I'd like to screen one of them, titled War Dance, that addresses the ideological stereotype of the Native as merciless savage. Play the clip.
We will further guide the inhabitants in the proper way of living. We will offer them our religion, our education, our life ways, in order to help them achieve our level of civilization.
Can you
and
cut
thus
it?
raise
Because we
them
don't have
and
visuals.
all their white brothers up from their savage and unhappy state.
That's not the right one. Oh wait, yeah, that is. Okay, go back to, yeah, that's good.
Further guide the inhabitants in the proper way of living. We will offer them our religion, our education, our life ways, in order to help them achieve our level of civilization and thus raise them and all their white brothers up from their savage and unhappy state.
We know that this is a 300-year-old problem, and the government refuses to fix it. The Longhouse people have been saying, we want to be part of the solution, but we are excluded.
That's it. You got yours.
Hello. All right.
Oh, that's actually my second.
That's all right. I just hope you weren't expecting me to sing or anything. Okay. All right. An optical and material rendering of Sitting Bull's vision, the always empty promise of the West as a collapsing of displacements, the haunting and remembrance by a ghost as the never properly buried and the never properly narrativized past, a performative reanimation and refusal of Frank Lloyd Wright's Mayan fantasy and architectural authority, a circuit of Black performativity, a choreographic analytic of the historiographics of dance, a seriality of Blackness by way of a television network conceit of multitudes, a meditation on surveying as cartography and intergenerational communion, a reimagining of a Black trans sex worker hero that enlivens the scant official record with a rendering of rebel glory. Mountain Time, in many ways, is a collection of objects and resonances regarding historiography, culture, power, becoming, memory, desire, and aesthetics. It is a collection of unfinalizable and irreducible provocations, a collection of objects that offer vital questions in the place of impotent and patronizing answers. In this way, what I find most exciting about this exhibit is the ways in which it reminds us of the power of historiography over history, over the possibilities that we might have to reimagine and speculate and actually dream. So in that spirit, I'd like to offer a clip from some work that I've been doing from a film that I think has kind of an adjacent relationship to a lot of the questions raised by this fabulous show.
My mother had 12 of us children, and it troubled her in our heart, you know, the way we was treated. And she'd pray every night to the Lord to get her and her children off that place. Well, one day she was plowing in the field, and all of a sudden, she let out a big yell and started. My mother had 12 of us children, and it troubled her in our heart, you know, the way we was treated. And she'd pray every night to the Lord to get her and her children off that place. Well, one day she was plowing in the field, and all of a sudden, she let out a big yell and started singing and shouting and hooping and hollering. And Master Jim came running and he says, "What's all this going on out in the field? You think I sent you out here just to hoop and yell? No, sorry, I sent you out here to work. And you better work or I'll put this cowhide across your black back." And my mama, she just smiled all over her face. And she said, "The Lord has showed me the way. I ain't gonna grieve no more. No matter how you all done treat me and my children, the Lord has showed me the way. And someday, we ain't gonna never be slaves no more." And old Master Jim took that bull whip and started lashing Mama across her back. But she didn't say nothing. She just got up, went on back to the field, a singing and a shouting, I'm free, I'm free, I'm free, I'm free.
Yeah. So I'd like to begin with a quote by the filmmaker Jatavia Gary. One of the things she said in one of our conversations was, quote, I am simultaneously creating and destroying, remaking and unmaking. My intimate interaction with the archive expresses my desire to be a part of it, to make my presence felt in and on that history, while also interrogating it, end quote. That which is beautiful and holy, an entanglement. Jatavia Gary's 2015 film, An Ecstatic Experience, derives its title and arguably its enraptured spur from Kathleen Collins's 1982 feature film, Losing Ground. Ecstatic Experience is the research interest of Collins's philosophy professor protagonist, Sarah Rogers. Rogers works to conceive of ecstasy in ways more attendant to the artist's practice than to the strict terms of Christian doctrines. She must also manage the new ecstatic experiences developing in her life. As Rogers states while researching in the library, quote, if ecstasy is an immediate apprehension of the divine, then the divine, it is energy, end quote. The energy of an ecstatic experience in total is a churning of performativities, affective economies, and temporalities. Black matter, a holy syncretic revolution. So what I've just showed you is from a section of the 6-minute film, and it is the second section. And this section begins with Ruby Dee on a television stage performing a slave. This is the slavery episode for the History of the Negro People series broadcast on national educational television in 1965. Dee is a woman reminiscing about her mother's refusal to be a slave. She remembers her mother working in the field. She remembers her mother stopping and shouting, someday we ain't going to be slaves no more. I'm free, I'm free, I'm free. A black body at rest is a conspiratorial act. A woman caught the spirit, and for that she caught cowhide lashes. Before suicide by cop, was there suicide by overseer? Ruby Dee is reading an Ossie Davis penned adaptation of an account given by Fannie Moore, a woman born a slave in South Carolina in 1849. Miss Moore gave this account in 1937 at the age of 88 as a part of the WPA's Federal Writers Slave Narrative Project. During Dee's monologue, Gary's animating hand on the surface engineers the narrative beneath, the love below. This is a remediation. Again, her direct animation practice stipulates process and energy, trembling, cellular, mitochondrial, animated shape fury, the shape of things to come. Ruby Dee meets mitosis. Her image divides. Framed by cubes and triangles, she is crowned, scarred, erased. She persists. Speckled and haloed, unbowed and sainted, transmogrification, radiation ruling the nation, black matter, 2 trains running, 2 freedom circuits, 2 temporality scripts, a fusing of a rebel slave and a civil rights celebrity, a memory of resistance and performative historiography. An arcane and prodigious, an ecstatic experience deregulates the American archive. The film's historiographic circuit deliberates on worship, states of freedom, and resistance. Dead reckoning, liberation cartography. What do you call a film compelled by many stains, genealogies, materials, and conceits? World making, black making? Be anointed, be still, escape, exile, resist, live, fuck it, get free. a black woman's hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So powerful. So I'm going to be talking today about archives, archival theory, and how we do time-based media conservation at the Whitney, and how they all play off each other, in my mind. And there's going to be a lot of diagrams, and there's a lot of archives, so I thought I'd start with a few pictures from the actual archives at the Whitney. Next slide. And to set this up a little bit, we have an extensive collection of materials from the avant-garde reference files of Barbara Moore, and I was thinking about film and archives. And this popped out. George Machinas is a founder of Fluxus. He actually designed the first anthology film archives interior space at 80 Wooster Street. And you can see in the squared where it says over, he designed those stairs, and it's fascinating to see the stairs here, so part of the architecture. Next. Like here, like Chrissie's curatorial work, he actually did a Flux Film Fest in 1966, of which this is a broadside for. Next. And so when thinking about diagrams, and before I get archival theory, George Machinas was really into structural aspects of filmmaking, interestingly enough. And here he's sort of unpacking P. Adam Sidney's take on structural film. Which I find a really fascinating sort of take on that. Next. And again, once we get to the diagrams, here's his actually really interesting piece on thinking and diagramming thinking, which I think is really fascinating, because when we go to archives now, you'll see that diagramming in the next slide is really a part of thinking about how we unpack what archival materials are. Next slide, please. So when we think about archives and how we conceptualize archives, in archival sciences, there's this concept called the life cycle model, which was actually developed in the United States in the 1960s. And really, this is what we think about when we think of archives. Someone creates a record, they're actively used, they're semi-actively used, and then they're deposited in archives, right? Well, this is very linear. It starts at the beginning and it ends, right? It's very finite. I mean, it's an interesting concept because that's how we conceptualize in archives. You go to a repository to view materials that have been used. But what I think about the archives, there's another model in the next slide, which is an Australian model called the records continuum, which I think is a very powerful theory of how we conceptualize archival materials, and that it's not linear, is what you'll notice here. It's actually very circular. And time is a different sort of unpacking of how archival records are understood with materials, but how they reverberate throughout time. And there's an archival historian named Michelle Caswell who unpacks it like this. The records continuum as a model is not, the archives are not a stable entity in this theory to be tapped for facts, but rather a constantly shifting process of recontextualization. And I think we see that with a lot of works here at Mountain Time, how the archives really reverberate through different uses, how they're really remapped and reconfigured and recontextualized. So which brings me up to the next slide and how we sort of think about media preservation at the Whitney as well, because we do a lot of work with time-based media to preserve them, the digital or the analog materials, but also we really want to think about how they're understood. For example, here, they're installed at the Aspen Art Museum in a particular way. There's a lot of care taken into how it's installed, artist instructions, and we really wanted to think about how that experience of viewing a time-based media work reverberates throughout time in our thinking about the preservation of these works. And so, it's interesting to see these diagrams and how they're circular and sort of, reverberate out. And so we work very closely with staff, with artists to capture information through correspondence, through installation images. But it's interesting to see how, like Michelle Caswell said, how these things can be recontextualized. But how do we sort of come back to the center and go out? And so rather than a linear model, we think about as echoes and reverberations throughout time and how things are installed. And I think it's really for us to think about, that notion of experiential conservation when you view a work here and you see it again, perhaps in 10 years in a different space, how that experience can shift and change. And part of our thinking is to unpack that through archives, through understanding how materials by artists and scholars and installers and preservationists really think about understanding and situating a work of art, not only now, but in the future, and then the future going backwards, right? Because when you install a work, you are informed by how they were done in the past, and the same is true for performance, understanding how to restage materials, how artists reuse materials within their own works. So thinking about archives in a more globally larger way, time-wise, because the time span of an archival record, as we know, is not that linear cycle, right? It's more circular and inclusive of us thinking about how to situate time-based works of art, but how artists actually work with those time-based works of art themselves. So the next slide. So we are actually trying to think about two other, owners of works, whether in editions of a work of art, how we can sort of collaborate in the stewardship, because there's a lot of mutual stewardship of this across different collectors, institutions, and really for us at the Whitney to think about it as a network, as a sort of collaborative way to think about custodianship of these materials so they flourish throughout time. So we can understand how they're installed in the past, but in the future, and working together to get these archival materials in a way that really brings it to life for future scholars, for future curators, for the artists, and in their work as well, to think about it as a continuum. And then the next slide. So we think of it as a collaborative model, like we said. And I think going back to this diagram, this like sort of continuum circular model is really helpful to think about how to situate these works and using the archives as a way to really activate them as well. So next slide, I think, is my final slide, which is an image of seats. And so we take it to the audience now. And I hope I was under 8 minutes, because I was trying to go really fast. Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you, Farris, and thank you to all our speakers. We, of course, could talk all day between us, but we want to give people the opportunity who are sitting here with us to ask questions or any observations. Also want to acknowledge Doug Aitken here, whose migration empire is downstairs, as well as Maya Ruth Lee, and Maya's The Stranger. There are so many questions to be raised in general about the archive, and also what Farris said about revisiting a work. I mean, first time I saw Migration Empire, Doug, was, I think, when it was made, and it resonates in the same way and in a completely different way now. And likewise, when Maya, I first saw your video in New York for Aspen, you've now moved to Colorado, and you created an environment and an installation responding to the site. So this your journal, which is a kind of going into your own archive, then has a completely different context. So what Farris was saying, also in relation to all the artists we've heard from, also Michael and Jatovia Gary's wonderful film is in the Whitney's collection, it is very, very much a process of rethinking, recontextualizing, reinterpretation, and different collections, different ways in which work is understood, and then scholarship and dialogue shared, which is also part of the importance of a panel like this, as well as the film programs that will be unfolding over the summer as the show progresses, are a way of also sort of creating the future, if you like, and recreating. So those are some preliminary thoughts after hearing everybody. Do people have questions or thoughts? Yes, Larry.
Well, yeah, sorry. I mean, the concept is very complex, so trying to distill it in 2 minutes is hard. But I think the continuum model, the circular model, really opens up an archival record into a larger sphere of time and space. So an archival record that is created at a certain past can be revisited, and there can be revisionism in terms of rethinking what that archival document can mean in one time and then another. But the interesting thing about the continuum model is not only this recontextualization, but also how it's part of the archival history itself. So the linear model really starts and it ends. It goes to the archive and people are like, oh, it's dead, it's in the archive, right? But the continuum actually posits that it's part of the same continuum, it's part of that same narrative. Even if it's recontextualized, even if it's revised, it's part of that history itself. So it's part of that sort of, network and enmeshedness with past, present, and future, which I find it to be a really powerful theory as an archival concept, because it really expands our notion of what an archival record is, as we see with a lot of the works in this show, I think, and Alan's work and Kandis's work and Krit's work. So I think it's really a part of that sort of dialogue with history and with contemporary time, whether it's mountain time or other times as well in the future.
One of the interesting things about Krit's living archive are the Whitney and the Tate and M+ in Hong Kong are 3 museums where only the complete living archive will exist. And so what's really interesting about that is to think about how you're challenging the institution, Krit, in a way, because you are asking the institution to bring in works that haven't been made yet. And that's a very radical proposal, in a way. And I think what that does also is to really make us think about not only the future, but the role of a living archive in unfolding things, maybe beyond our lifespans, maybe beyond, and certainly beyond a curatorial presence. And how does the institution take on something like that? And I think that idea of extended time in terms of how something is built also relates to what you were saying, Farris, and this idea of cyclical time, which is a very indigenous concept of time. Time is not linear. Mountain/time asks us to really think about those differences. The slash is very important because it creates a space for rethinking. And so this is really at the basis of so much time-based work because it's asking us to think about time in a different way. It's asking us to think about history, think about the future, but also think about how some of this archival material we can see, and not every work in the show is using archival material, of course. And Annika Yee's The Flavor Genomes, this wonderful work with you see with 3D glasses, is creating a different kind of time, a kind of a sort of imaginary time, an imagined time that is not archival, and yet talks about science and talks about science in relation to the boundary between the artificial and the real, just as Ian Cheng's Bob does. So in the case of that work, for example, that work came out of a dream that Ian had where a snake turned into a tree. And from that came, and that's very interesting in relation to your work, I think, Krit, and this idea of transformation, and then the relationship of that to artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence philosophy. So I think that one of the really sort of critical things about bringing all these works together in dialogue is the questions they raise. It's the beginning. It's the beginning of another group of questions. It's the beginning of another sort of extending of the discussions and dialogues and a sort of rethinking also what time-based media means in relation to everything the artists have said, and also the artists who haven't spoken but who are very much in the exhibition. Are there other thoughts from the audience or the the speakers. Yes, Ben.
Deeply intertwined with choreography and movement and body and dance, but also time-based media. If you're familiar with Simone Forti's practice of transmission and like training for perpetuation, I'm really curious what your thoughts are on that in terms of how things are communicated through time to sort of authorize re-performance.
I will just take the opportunity to finish reading Hannah's quote, because I think she actually really succinctly sort of deals with what I'm doing in the collage work and with performance and with the time-based media collage sort of practice. Where do we leave off? So Hannah says, the degradations of slavery and colonialism are reimagined as muses, nourishing supplements to the business of creation. Despite Graham's kooky fascinations, she hired and worked closely with black dancers from the early 1950s onward. Perhaps she looked to these dancers for reassurance that the primitive source was close at hand. But they were not her dupes. Black performers such as Mary Hickson forged their own artistries within Graham's choreography and beyond. Black artists turned the fantasy of the primitive to more constructive ends, following a principle of cultural survival rather than discontinuity with the past. The American artist Katherine Dunham went to Haiti to learn ritual dances of African origin, synthesized in the impossible conditions of the plantation and further developed in its revolutionary aftermath. Dunham felt this was movement that still retained its social power, the power to maintain life and ritualize conflict. She looked to its forms as antidotes to ambient anti-blackness in the United States. These embodied mechanisms of social integration offered, she thought, communal protection against the perception and imposition of blackness as a state of disintegration. The plantation, more than any other social form, inaugurated modernity. C.L.R. James, I would also add there a lot of time-based media. C.L.R. James called the slaves of the Caribbean the first modern proletariat in the world, just as W.E.B. Du Bois named the slave uprising that won the Civil War for the North the first general strike. Blackness is the vanguard of the modern, and Dunham's impulse was quintessentially modernist in its desire to access a prior condition of unmediated collective experience. It does not seem merely coincidental that ballet emerged in the same time and place as the capitalist world economy. In the 15th century Italian Renaissance courts, the corps de ballet, somewhat later in innovation, is a mass of identical performers, a mass of identical dancers performing identical movements. The corps anticipates the chorus line and the factory line, and implies the line of race. After abolition, the encounter between the courtly European formalism of ballet and black vernacular dance produced the mutations and canalizations of produced the distinctive character of American modern dance. This form developed alongside the mutations and canalizations of the plantation that recreated race as a civil and political question. Meanwhile, by the same token, they drove its lethal symbolisms deeper into the terrain of the unconscious. Movement fragmented into spasms, the symptom, or coagulation into fascist spectacle and corporate management. Yet in the sphere of black social dance, movement continued to signify freedom. Not the grand horizons of modernism, nor those of its thwarted correlate, revolution, but an imminent liberation grounded in the vitality of the body. Shared rhythms contained in collectivized feeling. In 1945, Dunham made the patriotic claim that the jitterbug originated in Jamaica. Quote, relieves the tension in violent dance, very free and unconfined. This freedom in the dance is an indication of freedom in our society. As George Paradise Garage in the 1970s, nearing the end, and 80s, the long hours of an all-night dance party expanded the time and social space outside of the working day. Unlike Laban's mass spectacles or Graham's fidelity to technique, this was movement as a negotiation of labor. Without this negation, dance becomes race play, as Graham and Laban openly recognized, if only because the body directly mediates history. Stance, gesture, and gait are cultural and hereditary, freighted with dead generations no less than political and art, no less than politics and art. Whenever it is scripted by labor and the commodity, dance is condemned to reinstate the black body image that anchors the teeming, pestilent vessel of race. In the vernacular dances of TikTok and surreal celebrity bodies, zones of production of blackface, the primitive source of hypertrophies flatten, spin, on one side an image of compulsory jouissance, and on the other an image of boundless objection, faster and faster until the two images blur, until this blurred entity appears animate. The reduction of the black body to pure myth or pure virtual image becomes the language that we're stuck with. I said about this hectic status. Thus in my collages, body parts and gestures repeat in Oedic despair, though not without beauty, which is a form of hope, never entirely captured by grid or line. The force that moves the body is also the force that moves the world.
Thank
Black.
you, Kandis.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It was Hannah. She's an
Yeah,
amazing
and
writer.
Hannah. Thank you. I had actually a thought also, because I think we have to wrap up soon, am I right? I'm trying to kind of also think about technology in relation to the moving image. And Krit, in your first film in the two in the cycle, where you talk about the drone, and you mentioned this in your, in your talk, and the drone at that moment was new technology that sort of changed our perspective to the possibility of a kind of much more sort of assertive vertical perspective with a lot of implications for that. But I wonder if you could just tell us what you think about that now that drone technology is being used in cinema and art installations so readily. What are your thoughts about that earlier film in relation to technology and what you were thinking about in relation to northeast Thailand, Isan, and the kind of encroachment of technology into the sort of, anyway.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll keep it really short. Well, that work was kind of made in 2014-15, and the drone that was used was the first prosumer drone, this DJI Inspire one that existed, and essentially I would say, I think each work marks like a response to time, ideas, and maybe things that felt like, to me, like a kind of zeitgeist feeling of then, and of course it changed. And yeah, looking back at that work now, that was a very kind of I think that was a kind of like, that was more of a maybe positivity towards like technology, even kind of the idea of kind of softening this kind of like essentially the regime of order, or the things that's kind of being used to categorize, the drones in the video, or like linked to the drones the United States used, and yeah, and I think there was like something there about kind of like writing and using my mother's voice, and like thinking, oh, like the drone is a spirit, and I don't know. And I think like when I look back at that work, there is some kind of it's almost like that same sentiment somehow seen of kind of like self like externalization and like representation also probably forms like in a way like even like things we see now like NFTs or something like that, it's hard to go into it, but I feel like it's connected, the idea of like the kind of like internet and freedom, and there are cases that I see like where that somehow it's linked. And I think in more now, and I think now perhaps I am more, and the works later after coming up, and I am more kind of like like perhaps aware and critical of the idea of like recording and documentary, you know, but I think in the last work I did actually, like, I guess there was like a move to actually not try to not use the document image at all, you know, but I think also, I don't know, it's kind of like it's almost like the dilemma or the duality that we or I live with, you know. We all want to record and keep, and also, but then also in that we change, and in that comes like maybe the violence in it, because we also, that drone itself and that entire, like, you know, it lets in a certain kind of order, a certain kind of, like, you know, it changes the space of formlessness to form, and often that's, you know, you always lose something to kind of make that recording in a way, yeah, which is like the present, basically, yeah.
Well, thank you to all the speakers. Thank you all for coming. And I hope you enjoy the exhibition, those of you who haven't seen it yet. And those of you who have seen it, go and see it again, because it takes a lot of time to look at, speaking of time. And I hope you'll come back again and again to see these fantastic works and the show. So thank you, everybody.